Warlords Ruin is a new dungeon that came out Friday, December 1st. I was prepared enough to have a day off to play such an experience, and this video didn't get made in the ideal time span due to me playing it so much. This dungeon is a fantastic break from the hyper-futuristic sci-fi setting that we're so used to within Whitefall, all whilst being coherent with the story and lore involving the Ahamkara, the Taken, and the Scorn. I hear a lot of people drawing comparisons to Lord of the Rings, Elden Ring, Dungeons and Dragons, especially Dungeons and Dragons, Harry Potter, and many more pieces of fantasy media. What I like about this dungeon is kind of how small it makes the player feel. It kind of gives the feeling that there's a lot of work to be done here and a lot of stuff to explore. Deepstone Scripts also does this extremely well on certain encounters, but I believe what Warlords does better in this specific case is kind of filling up the place with more alluring secrets that the player can interact with. Things like traps and cursed chests are the absolute welcome additions in my opinion. I do see myself getting tripped up by the occasional trap, and during my first playthrough with the chests, I learned that blue ether emanating from said traps are booby trapped, but it took a long time for me to grasp this, and I did get tripped up with the chests as well during time to time. But the more important part about these things is that they force you to pay attention and take a good look at the surroundings around you. These are an absolutely intentional design choice. They wanted you to have a better grasp and understand the area that you're looking at and prepare to move around them. This allows the player to better find things like secret doorways for future playthroughs. This fact, coupled with the eeriness from the story and dialogue, is what makes backtracking an absolutely mandatory effort. You get the feeling that there's more to it than what is relayed, and uncovering small and intricate secrets involving the story of the Warlords Ruin feels like you're peeling back layers of a tangerine, slowly but eventually piercing the skin of this fleshy enigma and removing the questions and mysteries involving this warlord's fortress, finally getting into the juicy parts and enjoying the answers of what remains within. The quest line tied to this dungeon is very long, and I would recommend taking your time with it. After all, you have 6 months of spare time to really bask in the content that you have during this season and that of the dungeon. Though whilst I am singing high praises for this dungeon, one of the main pain points that I do have is the loot and the kind of degradation of loot we've gotten so far with that of the newer dungeons that we have been getting. We used to get 6 weapons of legendary loot following Prophecy, Duality, and Spire of the Watcher, though I've been seeing a change with both Ghosts of the Deep and Warlords Ruin. We're seeing a lower loot pool of weapons that we get access to within Warlords Ruin, and in my opinion, there's not much over the rocket-powered sidearm that all seems to be interesting. To my disappointment, they fill this loot pool with strand weapons. A strand bow, a strand caster frame sword, a strand sniper, and the Sundering Origin trait perk that doesn't provide much benefit besides niche situations. I mean, seriously, when was the last time you were able to destroy a vehicle or inanimate object? For me, these events need to be more commonplace for me to consider the value of this trait to be worth the effort. The rocket power sidearm is pretty good. It's likely the first of many to come, and with one of the many drawbacks from using sidearms in PvE is that being close up is usually the ideal range to hit your shots. I enjoy a more slowed down, accurate firing option as opposed to spraying and praying that I would actually have to use with other sidearm archetypes. This thing would also roll with beacon rounds that enable tracking shots with this weapon, and it could also roll with Volt Shot, which is also an amazing option to use when using this weapon on ads. It has decent ammo economy and decent damage against yellow bars, and whilst I don't believe that this weapon is meta-defining like many had desired it to be, I do believe that this weapon has a nice place in the sandbox. I myself am searching for a nice roll of this weapon involving Volt Shot, as I do have one with beacon rounds and Adagio, and I find myself to be wanting something different. As for the other weapons, I don't really care for them. If I get a god roll good enough, I might take them out, with the exception being the caster frame sword. That archetype actually needs a buff for me to take it seriously. But this gives me a question to my general audience. Would you be willing to sacrifice a higher quality loot pool if it meant creating experiences that are similar to what you've seen within the Warlords Ruin dungeon? For me, it's likely a yes, as I've considered my first time experience of this dungeon quite the memorable one, which leads me into encounter design. And as for encounter design in general, I can't help but be very pleased with this result. Having 3 bosses in a dungeon really helps this dungeon a whole lot, and it adds to the overall evolution to what dungeons are in general. I wasn't often too fond with the traversal encounters that we were given in earlier dungeon iterations. A huge pain point that was specific, especially when it came to traversal encounters, was Grasp of Avarice. I don't care what anybody says, that Sparrow encounter sucked. It was fine within that one raid I always forget, but in this one I did not enjoy repeating that encounter. Ghost of the Deep's deep sea traversal didn't also really stick with me. As a matter of fact, the whole season with the deep sea traversal always felt like you were sinking rather than that of swimming, with the pressure mechanic urging me to complete the deep sea section rather than try to explore what was there. But with that said, I can completely understand that this could just solely be my pain point, but I do prefer this style of dungeon design, and I do hope that they continue with this in the future. I would love to know your opinion on the transition to full-fledged boss encounters. Do you like traversal encounters, or do you like what they are doing now with set encounter design? But back to Warlords Ruin. I really enjoyed the entry into the castle towards our first encounter. The first boss, Rathil, was quite the amazing first boss encounter. I do admit that I did have trouble involving the Kachin and destroying the taken eyeballs, but admittedly, it was only the least bit punishing to be picked up and help cleanse the blight totems. In all honesty, however, he was quite easy. The white circles around the totems gave me the signifier that I was supposed to occupy that zone for the blight totems to cleanse, and after that was the damage phase. The damage phase was fairly easy, to the point where I'm sure that many of you watching can easily 2-phase him with semi-optimal build comps and 1-phase him with optimal build comps in general. Next up was the jail encounter, and this one starting out was an absolute doozy. Communicating with your team and learning how the mechanics had worked was something that took quite a bit of time. If it wasn't our lead being relaxed and diligent enough to line up the context clues, we'd definitely be there for a few hours. Basically, in the 2 other rooms, there are streaks and a skeleton. The way the skeleton points is what direction I spin the gears in. The streak tablet is how much gears located on the top of the jail cells should spin in that direction. There are 6 gears in total, so a cell may have a 3-streak tablet with a skeleton pointing right. Those gears need to be spun clockwise, and the others counterclockwise. But after the jail doors release and you get through the maze, there is my favorite encounter, the Locust of Wailing Grief. Blow out the taken eyes to summon a Scorn boss, wait till it has summoned a Blight Totem, kill the Scorn to form another Blight Totem, leaving 2 to cleanse, but you will start to feel cold due to the blistering winds. If it reaches 10 stacks, you freeze to death, so stay nearby the torches and lose the stacks. When you cleanse these blights, braziers will light up, and since there are 2 totems to cleanse on each side, that would make 4 braziers to light up. You take 1 each and light the podiums, and preferably save the last one for the back podiums because then you're starting closer to the boss. But with that, your damage phase occurs. Make sure to step on 1 podium at a time and move to the next podium when the buff timer runs out. Do this until all podium flames are gone. Wash, rinse, repeat until the boss is dead. What I like about this encounter is entirely the pacing. During every stage of the event, you are doing something that is important and contributing towards your team. It is all hands on deck and micromanaging the eyes, to the totems, towards grabbing the flames and lighting the braziers to face the final boss. This action feels very smooth and very complete when they transition to each stage of this encounter. They each have a balance and flow towards it all, and it feels like a complete boss fight that is easy to understand, but the harder parts are micromanaging and maintaining the flow with ads and eyes pelting down on you. It makes part of this run high impact and demanding, which result is especially true if you decide to go to this route solo. Next up is a nice jumping puzzle and then the boss. Heffin's Vengeance is a boss that is fairly amazing. The ad density at the start was fairly tame compared to most other bosses, which eased the general stress that you would get from dealing with this encounter, no doubt. Blights that you can destroy infect the area, so it's best to remove them. But the mechanics here are all the same. Fire at the eyes until the Scorn appear, the Scorn summon totems, kill said Scorn for another totem to drop, but now you have the corruption debuff. You pass it to another corrupted hex drinker by meleeing them, whilst trying not to get meleeed back, and cleanse the totem. Wash, rinse, and repeat until you reach the top for some extra damage. DPS them until final stand. Survive and beat up the moldy meatball. And you have beaten Warlords Ruin. Overall, it's an alright boss fight. A controversial opinion that I have during this boss fight and overall dungeon is that it's a lot less stressful and punishing than the other dungeons, and I enjoy that fact. We have Ghost in the Deep and Duality for high octane pressure dungeons, and I really like having to enjoy the secrets without having the sheer intensity that often follows with those said dungeons. I had taken someone through this dungeon who didn't play it yet, and we had little to no issues. Overall, I do believe that this is a 9 out of 10 experience of a dungeon. The weapons kind of really held me back from considering this a 10 out of 10, so there's that. And whilst I think that the dungeon key to access the dungeon is quite hilariously overpriced, I do think that this is one of the best dungeon experiences to spend it on if you were considering to do so already. But with that said, this is Alchemist, signing out.